Okay.
They're flooding in now.
Okay, we'll mute.
Kia ora, Tony.
Hello, DB, how are you?
Not bad. Bit more history today.
Yeah, 100 and Kia ora, everybody. Lots lovely faces appearing. We've been muted again, sorry. I'm the Director of Alumni at the Development Office in University of Otago. It's my privilege to welcome you tonight and introduce our speaker. Could I just please check everybody has their computers or whatever they're using device on mute, please? Makes it a lot easier. Thank you for us. It's our privilege tonight to introduce the first in a series of 3 presentations called March with Otago. And the other 2 are listed in the invitation that you would have got. This is the first. We've got another one coming on the 18th of March. We've had a fantastic response to these presentations, so great to see so many alumni interested in them coming along tonight to hear Professor Tony Ballantyne speak. So Tony is currently the Deputy Vice-Chancellor External Engagement at the University of Otago. Tony actually did his first degree here at Otago, so he's an alum, and then he went on to do his PhD at Cambridge. He has worked in Ireland and the US before coming back to Otago, and here at Otago he has held positions as the HOD of History and Art History at Otago. He then became the Pro Vice-Chancellor of Humanities for about 6 years, and more recently he has become the Deputy Vice-Chancellor External Engagement. Tony is recognised as a world-leading historian of the modern British Empire, and he's worked extensively on the development of colonial knowledge, changing understandings of language, religion and race, and the uneven webs of exchange and connection that gave the empire shape. In recent years, much of his research has come to focus on the changing place of New Zealand within the British Empire. He has published extensively on missionaries, literacy and print culture, cultural mobility and histories of place and empire and colonisation in cultural memory. He's currently completing a volume on the changing place of James Cook in New Zealand memory and culture. Tony was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand in 2012, and in 2016, he won its Humanities Arona Medal for Sustained Innovation in Humanities Research. So it is our great pleasure to welcome Tony tonight. If you have questions, so Tony will speak for around about 35-40 minutes, and he's got a great presentation with some lovely imagery. But if you have any questions, please put them into the chat function, and then I can help get your questions in front of Tony. We are looking to finish at 8 o'clock on the dot. So it's my privilege to welcome Tony. So Tony, over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. He minui ki te mena whenua. Would you mind please putting your computer on mute so I can hear what you're saying? That would be very helpful. Thank you. He mihi nui ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohi, waitaha ka te mamo ai kai tahu, kina mana whakahi, kina wai tiri nei, kina rangatira huhua, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi. He te kai whakahaere o tēnei hui, a Sheila, tēnā koe e hoa, i ngā rangatira, i ngā homahi, i ngā tangata katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's great to see you all. It was great to see some family and some friends and members of the wide University of Otago community joining us here this evening. And it's great to have the opportunity to share some thoughts on New Zealand history and how we make sense of it and what it means for us in New Zealand today. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us this evening. In the talk, there are basically going to be 3 sections. The first one, I'll share some thoughts on what we should know about New Zealand history. In the second section, which is reasonably short, just some reflections on history and identity. And then in the third section, I'll come back to thinking local and think about this place, Otago, for example, and particularly the context for the establishment of our university. So debates over how we think about our colonial past in New Zealand regularly flare. In recent times, there was protracted debate about the Tuia 250 program that was designed to mark the 200th anniversary of the arrival of the Endeavour, captained by James Cook. Then in 2020, the toppling of the statue commemorating Edward Colston in Bristol, a merchant whose substantial fortune was entangled with the Atlantic slave trade. That event re-energised debates in New Zealand about statues and how to remember our colonial past here in these islands. At the same time, there was a long-running debate over the place of New Zealand histories in the school curriculum. What kind of history should our children be learning? What should teachers focus on? And what kinds of themes or stories should be set aside? And that was a protracted debate, both within the education profession, but within society more generally. And of course, most recently, there have been a series of arguments over the legitimacy of New Zealand as the name for our nation and the suggestion that it should be renamed Aotearoa. And of course, as you'll see in one of the headlines there, we see some influential Ngāi Tahu leaders. This headline is about Edward Ellison, but also the Kaitahu historian Te Māori Tau have come out and stressed the primacy of Te Waipounamu as the name for our whenua here in the south. So these debates are a common feature of public life in New Zealand. So given that these questions are politically contentious and often people feel like they feed a whole lot of conflict, why should we really care about New Zealand history? And more broadly, if we are to care about New Zealand history, what should we know about the history of these islands? It has become commonplace in academic circles to suggest that New Zealanders, especially Pakiha, are uninterested in the past and that we are adept at forgetting some difficult histories. In reality, I think this is a fairly partial and not particularly useful characterization. There is a very long tradition of writing about our history. The first general history of New Zealand was published in 1859, and here you see the title page, a work by the military doctor, A.S. Thompson, which reflected on the transformation of Māori society, the beginnings of colonisation, and was critical of, we might note, both James Cook, but also the government's lack of engagement with Māori. So there's a long tradition here. Within 20 years of formal colonisation, histories of the country were already being written. But we have not generally taught our history in a sustained manner in our schools. Until recently, students in years 7 to 10 would learn in a piecemeal fashion about the Treaty of Waitangi and some other significant aspects of New Zealand history in the social studies curriculum, and few students took history, comparatively few students took history as a subject in years 11, 12 and 13 for NCA. And even those who did take history in those higher years of secondary schooling did not necessarily study New Zealand topics. So I think it's incredibly important for us to teach about New Zealand in our schools in both social studies and history. This is critical if we want to build cultural understanding and an appreciation of the forces that have shaped our society from the settling of New Zealand from Polynesia by the people that would become Māori, through to contact with Europeans and then the subsequent colonisation of these islands. And I think it's very important that history in schools should not just be a rosy story of the nation's progress. And of course, that's a temptation we see in many nations across the world. But rather, we should have a really thoughtful and deep engagement with the history of our islands and the people that have made their homes here. Now, I think it's true that colonisation is the central fact of New Zealand history and of our cultural life, and it must be prominent in what is taught. We cannot run away from our colonial past, nor should our children be sheltered from it. Certainly, the New Zealand wars need to be explored, analysed and understood. And of course, it was the effort of some North Island high school students who put together a petition around the need to teach the New Zealand wars at high school. It was one of the main catalysts for these debates. But those wars should be not only understood in their military context, they need to be also appreciated in their economic, social and political Students need to be able to understand the broad contours of our past, about colonisation more broadly, about how disease, war, land alienation and confiscation, and environmental change undermine Māori political authority in communities and shape the development of New Zealand society. And this great image here from Te Papa captures that extent of environmental change. And of course, that was one of the key features and drivers of colonisation. I think it's really important too that there is a broad grappling with the importance of race in our history. It's important that our children learn about the experience of Moriori in the 19th century and the 20th century, the history of anti-Asian immigration laws and New Zealand's Pacific Empire. In the 20th century, of course, there's the continuing marginalisation of Māori, Pacific migration and the dawn raids of the 1970s are the kind of topics you'd also want to see our high school students grappling with. Those stories need to be brought into dialogue with, so those stories are, and in many ways, the difficult stories, the stories that might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. And they need to be brought into dialogue with the stories that we're much more comfortable telling about ourselves. So it's kind of progressive histories, which we're keen to retell. You know, stories about the signing of Te Treaty o Waitangi and its intent, stories about women's suffrage and the Great Petition and the legislation of 1893, stories about New Zealand as a world social laboratory and our progressive history of social development and policy innovation. So that those absolutely have to be part of the story, but we need a balanced approach. I think it's also really important, though, that we think as historians and as teachers, and we teach our students to think locally as well. So in addition to being introduced to the elements of the national story and how they relate to each other, it's essential that teachers ensure that their pupils actively engage with local histories, the stories of hapu and iwi, of families and individuals who shape their places and communities. Local histories matter at least as much as the national story. And of course, our perspectives on the past vary significantly depending where we are located in the world. The world seems a different place if you live in Parnell or Papatoetoe, if you live in Aranui or Fendalton, if you live in Roslyn or if you live in Caversham, Rawene or Riverton, or like these Cantonese miners if you live in the Ida Valley or you live in central Wellington. And this is something I'm going to come back to in the final section of the talk. But it's also really important, and this image reminds us of this, that our school pupils are introduced to wider forces in history. They not only learn about an isolated New Zealand history, that New Zealand history should be part of them being introduced to the wider history of the world. New Zealand school pupils must continue to learn about the two world wars, the Holocaust, political conflict in Ireland, subjects that were a long time staple of the old high school curriculum. civil rights movement in North America. And I know my daughter, who's doing Year 11 history, is currently learning that. And it's absolutely fantastic that she gets to engage with that kind of material. So it's really important that our students get that wide perspective. Having some knowledge about those developments not only helps our young people understand the world that we live in, but also provides some context for important elements of our own national history. So I think it's important that high school students should learn something about 18th century British and Irish history, understanding the history of New Zealand politics and culture, and making sense of Pakiha identity is very difficult without some basic knowledge of modern Britain and Ireland. And of course, Britain built a world-spanning empire, and having some understanding of how the movements of animals, people, money, things, and ideas around that empire helps us understand how colonial New Zealand developed. What is largely, or actually in fact almost entirely absent in many contexts from New Zealand schools is any serious engagement with Pacific history. And of course that is the most immediate of those broader contexts for New Zealand history, and it is a key cultural frame for contemporary New Zealand life. We are a Pacific society. Our motu, our islands are within the Pacific Ocean, and it's really important that we think about Pacific history as the broader context for our national story. And I think that is a very serious gap that must be addressed. So if we think about the story of New Zealand in World War I, we often think about Gallipoli, we often think about the Western Front. Those are hugely important stories. We think much less of our Pacific dimension of that story, our occupation of what was German Samoa, which was of course our first act beyond our borders in World War I, and it was a key passage in the extension of New Zealand's Pacific Empire. Most New Zealanders, until very recently, did not learn much or any New Zealand history at school. But I think almost all New Zealanders do have some knowledge of the past. And this is where I think the argument that Pakeha are forgetful is not necessarily very helpful. We all have those rich tales of making homes and forging relationships, narratives of love and loss that are central in family stories, tales of faith and belief, sickness and health, hard work and recreation, the kind of stories that are repeated within families about parents, about uncles and aunts, grandparents, cousins, earlier generations. We access those stories through family trees and through whakapapa, through photo albums, and, as I said, through oft-repeated family tales. This image here is of my wife's great-great-grandfather, William Sherrick Burse, and his family in Glenorchy. They were publicans. Their family had moved up to Glenorchy, and they became quite prominent figures as publicans, and then they fell on hard times after a hotel fire and became scheelite miners. So, you know, if we think about each branch of our family tree, every branch is full of drama, full of emotion, and is really significant. So recognising and grappling with that human richness, I think, is really important. So our stories about our past are recalled not just in school classrooms, but in homes, on marae, in places of worship, and at cemeteries and urupa. And these human stories are vital threads in the histories of these islands, and they provide important perspectives on the past too. So what happens in school is really important, but that's not the only place where we think and we should learn about history. And of course, we encounter the past in all sorts of places. We encounter in our money, in our stamps. But if you think about our banknotes, we know and we encounter our national heroes on a regular basis. Sir Edmund Hillary, Kate Shepherd, Sir Apirana Ngata, Ernest Rutherford feature on our notes. And learning something about those iconic figures is really important. But looking beyond those national heroes, if you like, is also significant. And I think it's really important to recognise that for some people, thinking biographically, thinking about people's lives is one of the most immediate ways to engage with the past. So just to take one example, what do you know about Margaret Crookshank? Have you heard about Margaret Crookshank? Margaret was born in Waikaiti, or Hawkesbury as it was then called, just north of Dunedin in 1873. She completed her schooling at Otago Girls High School, and then she came to the University of Otago, where she studied medicine. She graduated with a degree of Bachelor of Medicine in 1897, just the second woman in New Zealand to do so. She subsequently became the first New Zealand woman to register as a doctor and subsequently to engage in general medical practice. And her practice was in the South Canterbury town of Waimate. She continued to study, taking a Doctor of Medicine from Otago and taking a short period of time away from Waimate to go to Dublin and Edinburgh to pursue further education. She returned to South Canterbury and she was an integral member of the local community, playing a vital role during World War I. And then she led the local response to the outbreak of the devastating influenza epidemic at the end of 1918. She herself became a victim of that pandemic, a bitter blow to the people of the district. She is the subject of one of the very few public statues of a woman in our country, a memorial statue that was erected by the people of Waimate in 1923, and it bears the inscription, "The beloved physician, faithful unto death." But hers is just one of so many stories. And one thing that I think is fantastic, and it's an amazing resource to explore, is our Dictionary of New Zealand Biography and all the associated resources that sit on the website Te Aora, the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, and that's at teaora.gov.nz, and it's an amazing website. So I think no matter whether you're 17 in a high school or 70, it's never too late to begin to think about the history of these islands, to explore the landscape, to go to our museums, and we have some amazing heritage institutions in the country, to read widely and to think about the forces that have shaped our communities. And of course, it's not even too late to look at a few statues. Actually, Waimate has some fantastic statues in public art. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to talk a little bit about the connections between history and identity. And one of the reasons why history matters is it helps us understand the society that we live in. This section of the talk is fairly short, but it makes some really important points. This is a hugely important image. It's a drawing of cross-cultural contact, a trade between a European figure, who was actually Joseph Banks, the botanist on the Endeavour, and a Māori man at Uawa, or Tolaga Bay, in 1769. And it's a moment of reciprocity and exchange. Banks is offering perhaps a sheet of paper in his right hand, or perhaps it's tapa cloth that he's bought from Tahiti. He's exchanging it with the Māori man with the very fine korowai, and in return, he's getting a spectacular crayfish. This is an image that's really important because it is produced by a man called Tupaia. Tupaia is a ritual expert, a cultural translator, a diplomat, a linguist, a remarkable traveller who came on the Endeavour with James Cook, travelling from his homeland in Raiatea, coming here to New Zealand and eventually going to Australia with the Endeavour, and he unfortunately died in Indonesia on the Endeavour's track home. It is a really important image though, because it I think speaks to that kind of triangular nature of our history, if you like, the engagements between the people that became Māori, the people that became Pakeha and Pacific people, and it reminds us of that broader Pacific setting for our histories. But it also speaks to the really important dynamic that comes out of these meetings, the sense of cultural discovery, a sense of self-awareness, a sense of a shifting place in the world. And that's captured beautifully in the haka composed by Mary Penfold and mobilised in the work of Anne Salmon that links this image to these kinds of encounters, really highlighting the idea about strangeness and mutual discovery. So engagements such as this generated new understandings about cultural difference, about the shape of the world, and about belonging. We have a remarkable account of Cox Arrival from a man called Te Horeta Te Tanawha, who was a young boy, maybe aged 8 or 9, when the Endeavour arrived at Whitianga. this was recorded in 1852 when he was very old by the collector John White. And it's a remarkable account. If you've got your phone and you're interested, grab a screenshot and check out the web link. It is an amazing account of the arrival of Europeans. So I've just given you two short extracts here. The account stresses the strangeness of Europeans, the way they looked, the way they talked, and the way they acted. So it talks quite a lot about the strange practice of who we know to be Joseph Banks, botanising. And it talks about young Māori people in Whitianga picking up rocks and stones and leaves and twigs and giving them to Banks, and he'll look at them and examine them and throw them away rather than putting them in his specimen bag. It talks about Banks using a gun, and it was the first time they saw a gun, and Banks shooting birds. And it talks about Cook himself, and it emphasises what they see as Cook's kindness, but also his strangeness. And one of the things I really like about the account is that one of the main markers of how strange Europeans are is that they rove to the shore with their backs towards their destination. Of course, for Māori, in a waka, you paddle forwards. And for a community whose world was defined by the ocean and where waka were so central in their cultural orientation, that's a really important marker of difference. So it's out of these meetings that ideas and identities emerge, amongst others, the idea of being Māori, being tangata Māori, or being Pakiha. And this is another pretty amazing text. This comes from an 1820 book, published under the name of Thomas Kendall, but produced together with the rangatira Hongi Hika, the great Ngāpuhi warrior chief, and Waikato, when they went to England. They went to Cambridge to produce a grammar of the Māori language. And this dialogue is fantastic. If you look halfway down the page, it talks about Māori as people of the land in English, and there is tangata Māori. Do the people of the land deal peaceably with Europeans? Later on, it says, ask the question, are the Europeans naturalised? Another way I think we might think about the sentence is, are the Europeans becoming normal? And the way that's described is ka Māori tia te Pakiha. So are Pakiha becoming normal? And the response, I think, is a great one. How can I tell you? I'm not sure. And it was probably an open question in 1820. But this is a great text because it gives you a snapshot of that process with these identities we're beginning to take shape. So running through these meetings is a question called Waikwe. Who are you? Where do you come from? Where do you belong? And through these texts, we get terms like tangata whenua, and this one, tangata Māori, where Māori with a small m means ordinary, normal, usual, natural. And we get the emergence of Māori with the big M, the ordinary people, the people of the place, the people who belong and were here before. And of course, Pakiha. And there's a controversy, there's been long-standing controversy about what Pakiha comes from. It probably derives from Pakiha, probably meaning strange being. There is a suggestion from Ngāti Porou that it could be a rendering of a shipboard chant, a European shipboard chant into Te Reo Māori. But the thing about Pakiha is that it's doing two things. It's saying that these people are new, that they're different, but it's also defining them in relation to Māori, tangata Māori, the people who are already here. The last one I really want to emphasise is takata pora. And it may be one that you're not so familiar with, but I'd like all New Zealanders to know, because this is actually the term that we see most commonly in texts before, say, 1835, before 1840, say, in Otago and Southland. This is the name that kaitahu give to the newcomers, literally the boat people, the people who have arrived on boats. So this is particularly given to sailors and to whalers and to the traders that come ashore, often from New South Wales, but also from France, from Britain, and from New England and North America. So I'd just like to end the section with this image by the great Cliff Whiting, an immense figure in Māori art, an amazing carver. This is the image he drew for the cover of the first Waitangi Tribunal report. And it emphasises the connections that both enabled the signing of Te Tiriti and the connections that spiral out of it. And of course, you know, for many Māori, it was understood that the treaty was a kind of covenant. It was a kind of sacred compact. Many colonists, on the other hand, largely disregarded it, not all, but many did. And they sought land, they sought opportunity and social advancement. And with time, many were largely disconnected from Māori. So that kind of entanglement and connectedness that this image imagines is not necessarily what actually unfolds, at least on the Pakiha side. So I'd just like to talk about that by really turning now to the place where I'm talking from the rohi of Kaitahu Whanui, from Dunedin, from Otago, and from the place our university developed in. So, as I said before, it's really important to think of the past not only in national terms, but to think about regions and places. And I think it is really important if we're going to understand the range and texture and complexity of the histories of the peoples of these islands, we need to really be committed to doing so. And doing that gives us also a really quite differentiated sense of the history of these islands, because the history of Otago and Southland is quite different from the history of Canterbury. My father was always deeply convinced of this. He believed that the Waitaki River was a very profound cultural divide. He was a chauvinist, I think, and a great lover of Otago and Southland and sceptical of things further north. But there's a long tradition of identifying strongly with our provinces, and there are very real differences. If you travel from Dunedin up to the East Cape, it's a different place. If you travel from the East Cape to the west coast of the South Island, it's a different place. So those local and regional histories are really important. So let's turn to Otago. And let's start with a boat. And actually starting with a boat is pretty much always the way we start in New Zealand history. If you think about the ancestral waka that came from the Pacific to settle Te Aka Maui and to Waipunamu and Rakiura, the Kohu and all the other motu that make up New Zealand. If we think about Abel Tasman arriving in 1642 with his two little ships, if we think about James Cook's endeavour in 1769, or if we think about maybe the Dunedin in 1882, which took that first shipment of frozen meat from Port Chalmers to Europe. So boats are really important for us, and much of our history starts with the ship. Down here in Otago and Southland, of course, we often think about the arrival of John Wickliffe. And this is an image of the Philip Lamb, which arrived on the 15th of April, pulling in towards Port Chalmers, joining the John Wickliffe, these first two ships to establish the Otago colony. The John Wickliffe had arrived a little bit earlier, on the 23rd of March, 1848. And it was a long voyage. And by the time the John Wickliffe was pushing east of Australia, its crew and passengers were looking forward to sighting the land that was to be their new home. They had left England over 3 months earlier. And of course, many of them on board were from Scotland, so they had earlier travelled to board the John Wickliffe. On the 18th of May, the passengers began preparing a special banner to mark their arrival in Otago. There was a challenge. They didn't have any suitable material immediately at hand, and eventually the ingenious Mrs. Nicholson, the wife of a Presbyterian minister, J.D. Nicholson, came up with a solution. She was prepared to offer up her wedding dress to create the banner. So her wedding dress of silk so blue was offered to create the banner that was carried aloft when the crew and colonists stepped ashore. On the following day, the 19th of March, excitement rose as the passengers saw the Snares Islands, and then Rakiura, or Stewart Island. On the 20th, the John Wickliffe sailed past of the Mata'au, or the Clutha River. The wind dropped the following day, the 21st, and progress was slow along the coast. Thomas Ferrens, a Methodist missionary who was dispatched to assist with Charles Craig's missionary work at Waikawaiti, quite liked the view though, as they were sitting off the coast. He was very impressed by what he called Saddleback Hill, or we of course know now as Saddle Hill, and noted that there were many striking landmarks. The day's slow progress left the colonists eager for land and for making it to their new home, but they ended up some 6 miles off Cape Saunders. They were struck by the abundant wildlife, especially the birds. Ferrens made a list. Birds of all descriptions are here: gulls, whale birds, sea pigeons, albatrosses, cormorants. He also went on to suggest that the air is most delightful. And we might be a little skeptical of this next bit. The sky is sultry, ethereal, quite of the Italian character. And I'm not sure whether that's an entirely plausible description or not. And his journal entry concluded, "Oh, what restlessness and anxiety to gain anchorages and to be on shore." He was really struck by the environment, Ferrens. It seemed to him that he was encountering nature triumphant, and the beauty of the harbour and its heavily forested shores was such that it made him rejoice and adore the divine being. Eventually, when they went on shore on the 23rd, he went with a party of other passengers and explored the bush-clad hills behind Port Chalmers. They didn't take any food with them, but they ended up sharing a meal of fish and kumara with 2 Kaitahu men before ascending to the very top of the hill behind the port. That shared meal that Ferrens and his colonial friends and Kaitahu men shared echoed an important moment that occurred on the previous day, March 22nd. On the 22nd, the John Wickliffe was held off the heads, but wasn't able to come into the harbour because of contrary winds. Charles Kettle, the New Zealand Company surveyor, also the artist who produced this image, and Richard Driver, the pilot, brought boats out to the John Wickliffe's anchorage. There was much discussion and excitement and some frustration at not arriving on shore. But some of the passengers used this time to good effect. Henry Monson, an English Methodist colonist who would become well known as Dunedin's first jailer and who was not necessarily particularly assiduous in his job, his son John and Thomas Ferrens went out in a boat. And they went out in a boat with 3 Kaitahu men who came to the John Wickliffe to take colonists fishing. The Kaitahu men took them to a place where they could catch barracuda, the most highly prized fish, an abundant fish locally, and taught them how to catch them using a long pole with a short piece of wood and a crooked nail at the end. They caught 3 magnificent barracuda and again shared a meal of fresh caught fish and kumara. Other passengers ventured out with other groups of Kaitahu, including one headed by the great chief, Te Mātinga Tairoa. These engagements, I think, suggested the possibility of a tradition of collaboration and reciprocity, but that tradition did not really take shape, and where it did take shape on occasion, it didn't endure. So I think that's an incredibly poignant and powerful moment to reflect on. And this sharing of food and knowledge was a warm and generous act. And it would be repeated many times over the coming years when Kaitahu worked closely to support and aid individual colonists. But as a collective, the colonists themselves increasingly turned away from the relationships implicit within the gifts of Kai. In the coming years, manakitanga was met with marginalisation. Kaitahu and their forms of social and economic organisation were often identified as a problem and were not seen as belonging to the community of the Otago colony. This Kettle image is fantastic, looking into the harbour with Port Chalmers on the right. One of the things that's very interesting is to notice the name he gives to the harbour, Otago, rather than Otago. And in this time, in 1848, many of the colonists called this place more broadly Otago, picking up on Te Reo Māori name for the principal settlement, and of course also the channel and current in the harbour. Port Chalmers, or Koputai, but Port Chalmers, as the colonists named it, was a key to the colony's development. It linked Otago to the world and was the beating heart of the colony. It pumped people, commodities, and money into the interior. And of course, the incoming tide of colonists would become increasingly less connected to mana whenua, as I was suggesting, particularly as they moved into the interior and turned their back to the sea. And central in that process, of course, was gold. And gold changed everything. The discovery of large gold deposits in 1861 radically changed things. Colonists flooded into the region. Gold made the young colony energetic and restless. And that's why I love this image from Princess Street in 1861. Just after gold's discovered, the long exposure time gives a blur of movement to the horses and to the people moving along Princess Street. And you get a sense of the dynamism of a society that's rapidly expanding because of the discovery of gold. Colonists flooded in and anything seemed possible, at least for a moment. My Ballantyne ancestors arrived in the winter of 1861, and my great-grandfather John and his dad Francis immediately set off for the goldfields. They turned out to be terrible miners. It was a giant disaster before they returned to Halfway Bush, where they also turned out to be pretty miserable farmers. So, you know, the story of our ancestors is not always one of immediate success. But because of gold, the city grew rapidly. The wealth of gold underpinned the increasingly sophisticated cityscape. The colonists established new workshops, factories and stores. Banks and insurance companies supported the growth of trade and shipping. The professions grew in significance. Churches and educational institutions proliferated. Think about our high schools, for example, and printing and publishing houses multiplied. Everything sped up, and the development of a university was seen as key to promoting advanced knowledge in the professions, the sciences, and in the arts. Colonists needed a university. They wanted graduates with specialist skills and knowledge to support an increasingly complex colonial society. There had always been the idea of a university to be established in the Otago colony, but the idea got greater currency in the mid-1860s with some very strong support from key leaders like the provincial superintendent, James McAndrew, and the Reverend Dr. Thomas Burns, the principal minister of the Otago colony. Many other public leaders, especially those further north, were sceptical. One parliamentarian dismissed the idea of a University of Otago as absurd. When the central government decided that New Zealand was not ready for a University of New Zealand, these men decided that Otago would go it alone. They found strong support from many Otago colonists and from the Presbyterian Church, which agreed to fund 2 of the 4 foundational professorships. And Otago's provincial government passed an ordinance on the 3rd of June, 1869, establishing the university. So our university was born out of the wealth of gold. It was born out of inspiration and vision, and more than a little bit of stubbornness. So, some final reflections. As we re-examine Otago's past, I think we need to balance an appreciation of old world inheritances with the realities of colonisation, which produced a layered, complex, messy, and often conflicted past. And I think that insight is applicable more broadly. So these difficult histories, these messy histories, these histories of conflict and accommodation, misunderstanding and struggle, they're our histories. They are the histories that have made us in the places that we live. They have made us as a national community. They have defined what is possible in our present. And they have been pivotal in shaping these places that we live in. And the legacy of these pasts are the things that we continue to work through. as a historian, I'm really deeply convinced that one of our roles is to engage with the historical dimensions of important political and cultural issues in our moment now. And as such, our writings function as a kind of critical dialogue between the past and the present. But, and this is something I always teach my students in history, our primary responsibility as scholars is to the past itself, to its pastness. And by that, I mean the ways in which the past is different from our present. And we have a duty to the dead who can no longer speak. It is our job to grapple with their human complexity, their motivations and aspirations, their actions and perspectives. So let me end by observing that many elements of our colonial past are painful and we can never fully settle it. People often imagine, and it's a kind of a vision, a positive vision. If we can work through all the Waitangi Tribunal settlements, then maybe we'll move on, we will have settled the past. I don't think we will. Each generation will discover the inequalities of colonialism anew. Each generation will have to grapple with the legacies and the issues that we're talking about. These are histories that cannot be erased, should not be forgotten, but rather should be reckoned with and drawn upon as a starting point for identifying what is our common past and also honestly exploring the fault lines that may well still divide us in the present. Carefully thinking about the past not only is good for our society, it enriches our lives and deepens our understandings of where we live, who are our neighbours, and who we are ourselves. And those, I think, can only be good things. So thank you. Thanks again for joining us. And I think Sheila's going to moderate a few questions.
Yes, I am. So thank you, Tony. I'll thank you formally in a minute. I'm just going to go through some of the questions we've already received. And there is the opportunity to put some more questions in the chat. So Tony, the first question we have is, thanks for the talk, Tony. An existential question for you. Does the identity as a New Zealander depend on knowing the country's history?
That's a great question. My immediate response would be, you can be a New Zealander, you can identify as a New Zealander without having a great knowledge of the past, but your understanding of what it is to be a New Zealander and particularly how other people might think about being a New Zealander and varieties of identity and belonging in our country will be much richer if you have an understanding of history. And I don't think that means you need to know the history from beginning to end. I think it is something that you can grapple with on a really human scale. It may be, going to a museum and spending, some time looking at particular objects, looking at some New Zealand art, and maybe mucking around on the web on the Te Ara, the New Zealand encyclopedia page, or reading the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography. So I don't think you have to master New Zealand history to be a New Zealander or to identify a New Zealander, but I think having a sense of our past makes our present much more understandable, and I think it makes our society much richer and hopefully more tolerant and understanding.
Great, thank you, Tony. Next question, how important do you think it is that Pakiha learn te reo?
I think it is. I think it's important, and I think it's one of the really, really positive changes in our society. If you look at the media stories of the last couple of years about the massive rush to enrol in te reo Māori courses, not just for Māori, but Pakiha, for all New Zealanders increasingly recognising the importance of te reo Māori, both as an official language of New Zealand, but also appreciating it as an important doorway or portal into te ao Māori more generally, into the Māori world. And again, everyone goes on their journey at their own pace and in their own way. And, I think there is an anxiety often around that journey. But I think feel the fear in doing it is a good thing, and being brave and even taking small steps is a great start. So I think it is really important. I would say, thinking broadly about culture and engaging with cultural difference is really great. And language is one really important way of doing it. One close to my heart, as you know, Sheila, is food. And that's another really important way of exploring the cultures in these islands. You know, go to a farmer's market or, a market at the weekend if you're in Auckland, go out to the big South Auckland markets and explore some of the kai there and the rich tapestry of cultures that make up our society. So there is lots of ways. Language just happens to be one especially good one, I think.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes. Next question and a comment. Masterful overview, Tony. How should we teach history in New Zealand schools?
So, we'll work through a process, the government's worked through a process of consulting around this. From my point of view, there are probably 3 or 4 main points. I think students need to be introduced to the Pacific context of New Zealand history. So they need to understand Pacific migrations and the settlement of New Zealand by the ancestors of the people who become Māori. And that's really important because we are a country located in the southern part of Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean. Pacifica people are a very important part of our society. And New Zealand has always been a part of the Pacific, and we have had a Pacific Empire. And there are real things that we need to reckon with there. So I think that Pacific element is central. Students need to be introduced to Māori history, and that's both pre-contact with Europeans, so the history of Hapua and Iwi, particularly in their local place, and then introduced to that story of what happens once Europeans come and then colonisation proceeds. And I think, thirdly, students should be introduced to local histories. And those local histories will shape how that second part is taught about Māori history and history of colonisation. But it will also mean that students will get an understanding of local landscapes and the particular pattern of local history, and that's really important. Because, the history of our places are really, really different. And, I said that before, and even neighbourhoods within cities are very different from each other. So they, for me, are the three key elements. And it's important that students are getting introduced to it really from a very early age on. And I would love to see more students carrying through to year 13. But I think that will be partly dependent upon us getting a richer range and texture of things into the classroom, rather than always teaching the same things in the same way. And that's something that, certainly university students say is that, we often operate within quite narrow channels. So the breadth of our history is amazing, and embracing that breadth is really important.
I think you may have answered this question, but there's a question from Melissa about, I'm aware that a huge tension, especially in primary schools, is navigating the uncomfortable histories. I note Sir Tiffany O'Regan's comments about history being nuanced and not diminishing this to a goody bad narrative.
Yeah.
Big ask for primary teachers with no special training in history. Do you have any advice for that, for those teachers?
So, I mean, Tā Tiffany O'Regan is a huge inspiration and an immense figure and a very wise man. And I would be a very silly person to argue against him publicly. So, much wisdom in what he says. Melissa, it's a great question, and you have identified, I think implicitly at least 2 of the real challenges. And one is the training of teachers for this, and the support for teachers. And secondly is also, I think, the materials to teach these stories with. And we don't necessarily have a great range of materials, and particularly at the local histories, and particularly for primary schools. I think, once kids are up and doing levels 1, 2, and 3 in NCA, there's a whole range of stuff for local histories. It's probably much harder for in primary school. So I think one of the best ways to do it is probably in conjunction with museums. That of course puts stress on museums, but and seeing some people in the audience with some museum knowledge and education knowledge, I think there's a real opportunity in that space for young people to be introduced to histories in really manageable ways through particular objects and particular individual stories. And, I always think about Toitu here in Dunedin, and it does a great job around the history of some objects, but also the portrait gallery that allows young people to explore the histories of individual people. But I think it's a great question, Melissa, and it really is one of the real world challenges in translating the kind of commitment we might have to the cultural importance of history into the classroom.
Okay. There's a question here from Joe. Kia ora, Tony. Is there a good primer on New Zealand history for someone new to the country, perhaps something akin to Zinn's A People's History of the United States?
Yeah, and Howard Zinn's books are, amazingly important, and it does a great job in capturing a range of voices and perspectives. There's nothing really quite like Howard Zinn for New Zealand yet. We've been really well served by our historians though. So I would give you a couple of recommendations. Michael King's Penguin History of New Zealand. It's a very positive and affirming history of New Zealand. It probably doesn't quite grapple with some of the difficult histories as well as I'd like, but it's a fantastic and positive framing of our story. If you want to read something that's a little bit more scholarly, but packed full of ideas and an entertaining read, James Bellich's Making Peoples, I think is fantastic. I also think actually there's still value in reading some of the older general histories. In the late 1950s, Keith Sinclair in the early 1960s, Bill Oliver produced very short, sort of 150-page histories of New Zealand that are great to read. But I would really recommend I think the best starting point is teara.gov.nz, so teara.gov.nz. Check that out. There's an immense array of materials there. And another great website is newzealandhistory.net. And they're great ways you can kind of navigate through a whole range of stories and are really good for anyone who's got that kind of digital sensibility.
All right, we've got time for one last question, and then if people have further questions, please just reply to the invitation that was sent to you and we will collate them and get Tony to have a look at them. Question, Tony. Now that New Zealand history is compulsory, what changes to attitudes would you expect to see?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I would expect to see changes, but not immediately. That's a generational project. I think a couple of things I would like to see is one is probably a greater understanding of the ongoing pain caused by the history of empire and colonisation. That is for Māori communities and then for Pacific peoples as well, who are subject to New Zealand's Pacific Empire. That's not a distant, removed, remote past. That has ongoing legacies today. And I think understanding that, but also understanding the emotional weight of that is really important. I think another really important shift would be a greater willingness to listen and understand to other perspectives. And that's one of the key things that history as a discipline teaches. I think that's hugely important. I just see that Jeff has kindly shared that link to Te Ara in the chat, so that's awesome. Yeah, and just I might end with Michael Reason's question. Colonisation was messy and complex and contradictory, and there may be things in it that people see as positives, and of course there are the obvious negatives as well. I think we need to, as a society, to get to a place where we recognise and we're comfortable with having those conversations, and take some cues from Tā Tipuni in that regard. But I think it's great to be imposing that question. I think we need to really be prepared to explore our past, to own it, and to recognise that it shapes our present, but that we're all the richer for understanding it. And that's probably a nice point to end at, Sheila.
Well, thank you. In particular, thank you so much, Tony. I'm always love listening to you present, and I love the imagery that you use. So I'd like to thank you personally, but also I know that all participants that attended tonight would have loved to hear from you. We will have a recording of this available, so we will let you know where to find that. But thank you once again. Thank you everybody who registered and come along tonight. I certainly look forward to seeing you on the further 2 presentations that we have. I'd like to also thank my team. They put this on tonight, and I'd like to thank them in the background for all of their hard work in putting this together. Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you at future functions.
Ka kite anō.
Thank you.
All right, Tony. Thank you.
Thanks, Stevie.